Manhattan, New York, 2:47 p.m., Saturday, the 10th of October, 1964. The brass and glass doors of Bergman and Sterling opened quietly on Fifth Avenue, reflecting the autumn sunlight off a storefront, long reserved for Manhattan's white elite. For decades, the boutique never needed a whites-only sign. The rule existed without ink or paper. And although the Civil Rights Act had been signed just 3 months earlier, Bergman and Sterling had only recently and reluctantly begun serving black customers, more out of legal pressure than genuine change. 2 women entered the store with calm, unmistakable confidence. May Johnson, 58, wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, pearl earrings, and a matching necklace. In her hand was a leather handbag worth more than what many Harlem families earned in 3 months. Walking beside her was her daughter, Ruthie Johnson, 29, dressed in an elegant cream-colored gown, white gloves on her hands, her hair styled flawlessly. They did not enter hesitantly. They walked in like women who knew exactly who they were and exactly what they could afford. For the first 15 minutes, nothing went wrong. A young white sales clerk approached, visibly nervous but attempting professionalism. May explained they were shopping for evening wear for an upcoming event and wanted to see the store's finest selections. Fabrics were examined, prices were discussed, colors debated. Their voices were educated, composed, unmistakably upper class, the voices of women accustomed to quality, even if stores like this had only just begun admitting them. Around them, white customers stared, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed resentment. But this was October 1964, not 1954. With the Civil Rights Act now law, open discrimination, at least in public, had become dangerous. Then, at 3:02 p.m., the door opened again. Charles Whitfield Peton III walked inside. 64 years old, Peton was a real estate developer who had inherited $12 million from his family's shipping fortune and expanded it into a $45 million Manhattan empire. He owned 19 buildings, controlled multiple development projects, sat on bank boards, and belonged to exclusive country clubs that still quietly excluded black members. Among New York's business elite, Peton was known for refusing to rent to what he called undesirables, his term for black families, Puerto Rican families, and anyone he believed didn't belong in proper Manhattan society. Peton came to pick up custom-tailored suits. Instead, he saw 2 well-dressed black women standing in the evening wear section being served by a white clerk. Witnesses later described his reaction as instantaneous and volcanic, his face flushed red with rage. He marched toward them, his voice rising with every step, until the entire store could hear him. What followed shocked even people who held racist views themselves. Peton unleashed a stream of racial slurs and vicious insults too offensive to repeat. He screamed that black people had no place in stores meant for white society. He called the Civil Rights Act communist legislation destroying America. He accused the women of stealing their money because, in his mind, black people could not possibly afford Bergman and Sterling legitimately. Ruthie began to cry. Peton escalated. He grabbed a $650 French silk evening gown Ruthie had been examining, threw it onto the floor, and declared it ruined because a black woman had touched it. He offered to pay for it, not to buy it, but to have it destroyed. He demanded the manager explain why these people had been allowed inside and threatened to withdraw his business unless the store returned to its old ways. The tirade lasted 5 to 7 minutes. No one intervened. Customers stood frozen. Employees watched silently. Respectable Manhattan society did nothing as 2 women were publicly humiliated. Finally, May Johnson took her daughter's hand and walked toward the exit, her head held high despite the tears streaming down her face. Peton followed them to the door, still shouting, still spewing hatred, yelling that the Civil Rights Act didn't change reality. What Charles Peton did not know, what no one in that store understood, was that the women he had just degraded were the wife and daughter of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. And within 72 hours, Charles Whitfield Peton III would pay a price so severe that it would destroy everything he had spent his lifetime building. Saturday evening, the 10th of October, 1964. Just after 4:30 p.m., May and Ruthie Johnson arrived at an office above the Palm Cafe on 125th Street in Harlem. 90 minutes had passed since they fled Bergman and Sterling, but the humiliation still clung to them. Ruthie's eyes were swollen from crying. May tried to compose herself, determined not to carry Fifth Avenue's hatred back home with her. Inside the office, men who knew Harlem's underworld fell silent. They could see immediately that something was wrong. According to William "Bub" Hewitt, Bumpy Johnson's longtime bodyguard and confidant, May tried to minimize the incident. She didn't want trouble. Not now. Not 11 months after her husband's release from federal prison. She described it as just an unpleasant moment, the kind black women endured even in 1964, Civil Rights Act or not. But Bumpy Johnson was watching his daughter's face. Ruthie couldn't hide it. When she finally spoke, the words came out in broken pieces, how a white man had screamed racial slurs at them, how he accused them of stealing their money, how he threw a dress on the floor and called it contaminated, how an entire store full of people watched and did nothing. Throughout it all, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson said nothing. No shouting, no threats, no visible anger. Only a tightening around the eyes, something those close to him recognized immediately. That expression meant restraint, not mercy. It meant calculation. When Ruthie finished, Bumpy asked one question. Did anyone get his name? They hadn't. They'd been too focused on leaving with dignity. But May remembered the store manager calling him Mr. Piton. He mentioned owning buildings in Manhattan. He was there to pick up custom suits. A man with money. A man who believed money made him untouchable. Bumpy nodded slowly. Go home, he told them. Rest. Take care of Ruthie. Don't worry about this anymore. I'll handle it. The way he said, I'll handle it, chilled the room. Hewitt later said Bumpy's voice was calm, almost gentle, but completely cold. When Bumpy Johnson reached that tone, someone's life was about to change forever. After his wife and daughter left, Bumpy didn't rage. He didn't pace. He sat down and began making phone calls. One by one, carefully, methodically. First, his attorney, Theodore Green. Then business contacts. Then men who knew Manhattan real estate inside and out. Bankers, politicians, information brokers, people who didn't consider themselves criminals but who answered Bumpy's calls anyway. By 0 p.m., less than 2 hours after hearing what happened, Bumpy Johnson knew exactly who Charles Whitfield Piton III was. He knew the size of his real estate empire. He knew Piton was massively leveraged. He knew which banks financed his projects. He knew which partners depended on his reputation. He knew which country clubs protected him and which were terrified of scrutiny in the new post-Civil Rights Act America. Most importantly, Bumpy knew where Piton was vulnerable. According to Green, Bumpy wasn't planning violence. Violence would bring police. Violence would end his freedom. Instead, Bumpy planned something far worse, something legal, precise, and devastating. Piton had used social power and racial hatred to humiliate 2 black women in public. So, Bumpy Johnson decided he would use social and economic power to erase Piton from Manhattan society. By midnight Saturday, the plan was already forming. By Sunday morning, it would be complete. And within 72 hours, Charles Whitfield Piton III would discover that in October 1964, racism no longer came without consequences. Sunday morning, the 11th of October, 1964, arrived quietly in New York, but for Charles Whitfield Piton III, it marked the beginning of an unseen collapse. Overnight, Bumpy Johnson had finished assembling a plan that did not rely on threats, fists, or gunfire. It relied on information, timing, and the new reality of post-Civil Rights Act America, where public racism had become a financial liability. The strategy was simple and lethal. Attack Piton from every direction at once, using only legal pressure so nothing could be traced back to a single hand. By mid-morning Sunday, Bumpy's intermediaries were already at work. Three banks that held substantial loans tied to Peton's real estate projects quietly received financial analyses of his portfolio. The documents contained no lies. They highlighted exactly what already existed: heavy leverage, delayed construction schedules, mounting debt, but framed those facts in the most alarming light possible. Crucially, they emphasized how Peton's public racist outburst at a Fifth Avenue boutique exposed any institution connected to him to reputational risk at a moment when civil rights scrutiny was intensifying nationwide. No orders were given, no threats were made. The banks were simply reminded of what association with a man like Peton now looked like in October 1964. That same Sunday afternoon, a second front opened. Civil rights organizations in New York, groups already stretched thin by protests and legal battles, received detailed accounts of Peton's behavior at Bergman and Sterling, along with documentation of his long history of discriminatory housing practices. They were told protests would be welcome, funding would be provided, credit was not required. The goal was not publicity, it was pressure. By evening, organizers were already drafting signs. Meanwhile, Peton's business partners began receiving phone calls and discreet warnings. Nothing dramatic, just credible information that civil rights demonstrations were imminent, that banks were reviewing exposure, and that remaining tied to Peton might invite unwanted attention. These men had invested for profit, not principle, and profit hated uncertainty. Late Sunday night, stories were quietly pitched to journalists who covered Harlem, housing discrimination, and civil rights. The incident at Bergman and Sterling, two black women screamed at, a dress thrown on the floor, slurs echoing through a luxury boutique, was now framed not as an isolated outburst, but as a symbol of how some Manhattan elites were resisting the new law. By Monday morning, October 12, the pressure turned visible. Protesters appeared outside Peton's largest residential building. Peaceful, lawful, relentless. Signs accused him of discrimination. Flyers detailed his Fifth Avenue outburst. Cameras arrived. Tenants began whispering. Prospective renters walked past. Inside bank offices, loan reviews were suddenly urgent. Inside boardrooms, partners started asking uncomfortable questions. Inside newsrooms, editors sensed a story that perfectly captured the tension of the era. Peton himself still believed this was coincidence. By Monday afternoon, he was juggling phone calls, reassuring partners, calming bankers, dismissing protests as overblown. But the damage came from simultaneity. Every problem fed the next. Each call confirmed the fear that something bigger was happening. By Monday night, tenant organizers funded quietly and advised legally held meetings across multiple Peton properties. Years of tolerated neglect and discrimination were transformed into collective action. Rent strikes were discussed, complaints were drafted, lawyers were retained. Peton went to bed that night believing he was facing a public relations issue. He was wrong. By Tuesday morning, October 13, the first loans were called. Partners began withdrawing. Protests expanded. Newspapers printed names. Country clubs started distancing themselves. The walls were closing in, and Peton still had no idea who had pushed the first domino or why. The collapse was no longer coming. It had already begun. By Tuesday morning, the 13th of October, 1964, Charles Whitfield Peton III woke up to a reality he had never experienced before. Every pillar of his life was under attack simultaneously, not violently, not illegally, but methodically through contracts, reputations, and social pressure. This was the nightmare no powerful man planned for, because it followed every rule. The first call came from the banks. Two of the three institutions financing Peton's largest development projects formally exercised clauses buried deep in their loan agreements. They demanded immediate repayment of nearly $9 million, citing increased financial and reputational risk. Nothing about the decision was illegal. Peton had signed those terms himself. His leverage, once the engine of his empire, had become its greatest weakness. He didn't have the liquidity. To comply, he would need to sell properties quickly, at losses, or find emergency financing at punishing interest rates during the worst possible moment. Within hours, the second blow landed. 4 business partners announced their withdrawal from joint ventures. Each cited concern over civil rights protests, media attention, and management instability. Their exits forced Piton either to buy out their stakes or watch projects collapse unfinished. Either choice drained capital he no longer had. The man who once dictated terms now begged for patience. Outside, the pressure turned public. Civil rights demonstrations expanded across multiple Piton properties. Protesters remained peaceful, legally positioned on sidewalks, holding signs and distributing flyers. But the message spread fast. Prospective tenants walked away. Existing tenants began organizing. Rent payments were diverted into escrow. Lawyers filed complaints. City inspectors took interest. Years of tolerated abuse surfaced overnight. Then came the social reckoning. 2 exclusive country clubs institutions Peton believed would always protect their own received detailed documentation of his behavior and the mounting controversy around his name. In the fragile climate of post-Civil Rights Act America, they panicked. One asked him to resign for the good of the club. The other suspended his membership pending investigation. The doors that had defined his status closed without ceremony. By Tuesday evening, Piton's phone stopped ringing. Invitations vanished. Dinners were canceled. Friends of decades suddenly became unavailable. The racism itself was not new, but its public exposure was unforgivable. In 1964, being openly racist was no longer just immoral, it was expensive. By nightfall, Charles Piton sat alone in his Midtown office, surrounded by documents, unpaid obligations, and unanswered questions. His empire was unraveling faster than he could understand. Every move he made triggered another collapse. Every solution created a new problem. What terrified him most was not the losses. It was the precision. Nothing felt random. Nothing felt accidental. This was not a scandal. This was a dismantling. And still, Piton had no idea who was doing it or why. That would change the next afternoon. Wednesday afternoon, the 14th of October, 1964. By then, Charles Whitfield Peton III looked like a man who had aged a decade in 3 days. He hadn't shaved. He wore the same suit he'd slept in. His Midtown Manhattan office was littered with financial statements, legal notices, and half-finished calculations numbers that no longer added up to salvation. Banks were demanding repayment, partners were gone, tenants were striking. Protests continued outside his properties. His social world had evaporated, and still, no one had given him a name. At approximately 2:30 p.m., a man Piton had never met walked into the office and introduced himself calmly. Theodore Green, attorney for certain Harlem business interests. Piton barely looked up. He waved him off, saying he was dealing with multiple crises and had no time for sales pitches or lectures. Green didn't argue. He simply replied, "I know. I'm here to explain why all of this is happening at once." What followed landed like a verdict. Green explained that nothing Piton was experiencing was coincidental. The bank loan calls, the partner withdrawals, the civil rights protests, the tenant organizing, the media scrutiny, the social exile, every piece had been triggered by one event. Saturday afternoon. 5th Avenue. Bergman and Sterling. 2 black women publicly humiliated. Slurs screamed. A dress thrown on the floor. The Civil Rights Act mocked as communist nonsense. Those 2 women, Green said, were the wife and daughter of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Piton's face reportedly drained of color. He laughed at first out of disbelief. Bumpy Johnson, a criminal just out of federal prison, couldn't possibly control banks, country clubs, business partners, and civil rights organizations. Green corrected him gently. Johnson's power did not come from intimidation alone. It came from relationships across Harlem and Manhattan, across race and class, across politics, media, finance, and activism. And when someone hurt his family, Johnson used every legal lever available to make that person regret it. Piton asked what he could do to stop it. Apologize? Pay? Publicly recant? Green's answer was short and devastating. Nothing. The loans were already called. The partners were gone. The tenants were organized. The damage was complete. This was not about reconciliation. It was about consequence. Before leaving, Green delivered the final message. The following Saturday, May and Ruthie Johnson would return to Bergman and Sterling. They would shop again. And if they were treated with anything less than absolute respect by anyone, what Peyton had endured this week would seem minor by comparison. Peyton did not respond. There was nothing left to say. 3 days later, on Saturday afternoon, May and Ruthie returned to the boutique. The store manager met them at the door with apologies. Peyton had been permanently banned. Sales staff attended to them with elaborate courtesy. Other customers, some who had watched silently the week before, went out of their way to be polite, even deferential. Outside, civil rights observers stood watch. When the women exited with their purchases, they were applauded. Charles Whitfield Peyton III never recovered. By December 1964, he was forced to sell 14 of his 19 buildings at heavy losses. His estimated net worth collapsed from $45 million to roughly $11 million within 4 months. He was expelled from elite clubs, shunned by former friends. His wife left him, banks would not lend, partners would not invest. He died in 1968, largely forgotten by the society that once protected him. Bumpy Johnson never claimed credit. He never needed to. In October 1964, the lesson spread quietly through Manhattan's elite. The rules had changed. Racism was no longer free, and sometimes the most devastating retaliation arrived without a single punch being thrown. The destruction of Charles Whitfield Peyton III did not end with his financial collapse. It lingered quietly, unmistakably across Manhattan in the months that followed, reshaping behavior in places where laws alone had failed. What happened after October 1964 was not fear of one man. It was fear of consequence. Within weeks, exclusive Fifth Avenue retailers began changing how they operated. Staff were retrained. Managers issued internal warnings. Policies that had once existed only as silent signals were dismantled in writing. Several stores that had long discouraged black customers without openly refusing service began advertising in black newspapers, making public promises of equal treatment. Not because morality suddenly arrived, but because discrimination had become risky. Bergman and Sterling itself became a symbol. In November 1964, the boutique hired its first black sales clerk. By early 1965, it openly welcomed black clientele and emphasized compliance with the Civil Rights Act. Other luxury stores followed, slowly at first, then more decisively, each understanding the same unspoken truth. You never knew who a customer was connected to anymore. The ripple extended beyond retail. Landlords across Manhattan began reviewing tenant policies. Quiet refusals became legal liabilities. Tenant organizations empowered by the example of Peyton's collapse formed across the city. Rent strikes became coordinated. Lawyers became involved. What had once been individual complaints turned into collective leverage. Among the city's business elite, the story spread in hushed conversations. Not the details, those varied depending on who told it, but the conclusion was always the same. A powerful white man had humiliated 2 black women in public, believing his money made him untouchable. Within days, his world collapsed. Banks, partners, clubs, and society itself abandoned him, and no crime had been committed in retaliation. Everything had been legal. That was what terrified them. The Civil Rights Act had existed on paper before. After this, it existed in practice. The irony was unavoidable. A man widely known as a criminal had enforced civil rights more effectively than courts ever had, not through violence, but through strategy. He hadn't set out to integrate Manhattan. He had set out to protect his family. Integration followed because power finally aligned with law. By 1965, Manhattan looked different. Not equal, not just, but changed. Black shoppers moved through spaces that had once humiliated them. Black tenants organized where they had once endured in silence, and businessmen who still harbored racist beliefs learned to keep them hidden because the cost of exposure had become unbearable. Charles Pettin's name faded. His buildings changed hands. His legacy shrank to a cautionary tale whispered among those who thought privilege meant immunity. The lesson of October 1964 was simple, and it endured. Power was no longer just about who you could hurt without consequences. It was about who could make you pay when you crossed the wrong line. And in the new America taking shape, that line had finally been drawn. What happened in New York in October 1964 was not just the downfall of one racist businessman. It was a moment when America quietly crossed a line it could never uncross. A line between an old world where humiliation came without consequence and a new one where power began to answer to accountability. Charles Whitfield Peyton III believed his money made him untouchable. He believed that screaming racial hatred in public was still acceptable, even after the Civil Rights Act had become law. He believed that two black women could be broken and forgotten in a Fifth Avenue boutique. He was wrong on every count. The retaliation that followed did not involve fists, bullets, or threats. It involved contracts, reputations, loans, and legitimacy. It followed the rules, and that was the point. In post-Civil Rights Act America, racism did not need to be outlawed again, it needed to be made expensive. The most uncomfortable truth of this story is not who fell, but who enforced the change. A man labeled a criminal succeeded where institutions hesitated, not because he was righteous, but because he understood power, he understood leverage, and he understood that dignity, once violated, demanded a response that could not be ignored. After that week, Manhattan's elite learned something they never wanted to learn. The era of consequence had arrived. You could still believe what you wanted behind closed doors, but if you exposed it publicly, the cost could be everything. So the question remains, not just for 1964, but for now. When laws are passed but justice stalls, who truly enforces change? And when power shifts hands, do we recognize it or only notice after someone's world collapses? If this story made you think, leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more true stories where hidden power, history, and consequence collide.